So, in today's class, we are going to discuss the English poetry in the 15th century, that is, immediately after Geoffrey Chaucer. So, you already know that Geoffrey Chaucer had set the highest standards in English language and literature in terms of poetry. And because of his great creative genius, he had set an example for all those who followed him. But the irony of the situation was that none of the poets who came after him they could, you know, equal the creative genius of Geoffrey Chaucer. They were called the imitators of Geoffrey Chaucer in both England as well as Scotland, and that is why they are known as English Chaucerians or Scottish Chaucerians because they try to follow they try to imitate the style, theme, and spirit of Geoffrey Chaucer in their poetry. But the poets were not able to keep up with the standards of Geoffrey Chaucer. I already explained this because of his great novelty of expression, his great creative genius, which Geoffrey Chaucer was. And there was a general decay in the style or uh, uh, in the poetry which came after Geoffrey Chaucer, uh, and that is why they remained somewhere far below the standard which was set by Geoffrey Chaucer because they lacked the creative imagination, they lacked the depth, they lacked the originality, they lacked novelty, which Geoffrey Chaucer had introduced into the English poetry. So you can call them just like the poor imitators of Geoffrey Chaucer, and uh, some critics they point out that contributed nothing to the advancement of poetry. But as I told you, they continued in the same spirit which Geoffrey Chaucer had given to the English poetry. So there are some traces or some signs of freshness and originality in their poetry also. So in today's lecture, we'll be briefly discussing about these poets who are called as English Chaucerians. English Chaucerians means the poets from England who followed the Chaucerian style, spirit, or themes. So, amongst them, the first one is Thomas Hoccleve, uh, followed by John Lydgate, Stephen Hawes, John Skeleton, and Alexander Barclay. Though they are not very significant poets, as already pointed out, their contribution cannot be neglected because they tried to continue in the same spirit as Geoffrey Chaucer. It was another thing that though they could not contribute anything great and original to the growth of English poetry, however, uh, their contribution, gave some freshness and originality to the poetry in this particular age. So we'll discuss them one by one. First is John Lydgate. John Lydgate, he was the most prolific poet of this age, and he has written long poems like The Story of Thebes and Troy Book. And just like Geoffrey Chaucer in Canterbury Tales, he paints a picture of the contemporary society of those times. Similarly, John Lydgate also, tries to portray the miserable conditions of the poor men in London streets. So the theme of this particular poem, in which he tries to paint the miserable condition of the poor men, uh, is that money is all powerful. And Lydgate was not a skilled metrist, just like Geoffrey Chaucer. And he also lacks that grace, that beauty of that wonderful style of Geoffrey Chaucer. So is the first English Chaucerian, that is John Lydgate. And you may remember some of his works like The Story of Thebes and Troy Book. And he has also tried to portray the social conditions, the miserable conditions of the poor men in London streets. And uh, next is Thomas Hoccleve. Thomas Hoccleve is a kind of satirist. Okay. And his principal work was La Mel Regal, which is partly autobiographical and as a satire against poverty. Again, you can see here, Geoffrey Chaucer also, he presented the social satire in the Canterbury Tales. So Thomas Hoccleve also tries the same thing here. Okay, he writes a satire against poverty. And uh, another work of Thomas Hoccleve is the Regiment of Princes, in which he satirizes the fashions in dress. So, in a dialogue with a friend, he harshly satirizes women, the church, and the clergy. So, you can understand. Geoffrey Chaucer also, he also satirizes the society of those times. But he has that genius. He was a man who had that creative genius. He was a creative genius, and he presented a wonderful picture of the society of his times. The same spirit was followed here also by Thomas Occleve, but his writing, is also focused on men, women, and church and clergy, which Geoffrey Chaucer also did in the Canterbury Tales. But because of lack of originality, because of lack of that touch of uh, creative imagination, these writers, these poets, they fall far more below the level or standards set by Geoffrey Chaucer. And otherwise, the themes, they were following the same spirit. That is why they are called Chaucerians. He exposes the clergy for neglecting the duties and having a materialistic attitude to life, which is exactly what Geoffrey Chaucer does in Canterbury Tales. He paints a sordid or very, uh, you know, uh, uh, disheartening picture of the church officials who have become corrupt, and they have taken, and course to materialistic ways of life. They eat, drink, and they engage in all those things which are forbidden for a very pious person who is related to the church, right? So similar thing, these people also continue, but they are not able to achieve the same benchmark, the same standard as Geoffrey Chaucer. And other works are Complaint of Our Lady, Murder of God, and you can call him a poor imitator of Chaucer. So you can remember one, two works which are important, like the Regiment of Princes. What does he satire? It satirizes fashion in dress. Okay. Then he satirizes women, then church and clergy. And he appears to be dull, and there is no originality in his poetry. That is what, kept these writers far below the level or standard of Geoffrey Chaucer. And his style also shows that decay, that decline, okay, and with a kind of degeneration after Chaucer's death, because they lack that creative imagination. They lack that originality in their verse, which Geoffrey Chaucer had. He also uses rhyme royal, the heroic couplet which was used by Geoffrey Chaucer. But it is very loose, and it appears kind of superficial. Uh, it's not able to write as elegantly, as beautifully, as technically as Geoffrey Chaucer. Okay, so that was Thomas Occleve. So these two poets, they are the major English Chaucerians. Others like Stephen Hawes. Stephen Hawes, he was also a follower of Geoffrey Chaucer. He imitated him in terms of allegory. Uh, he was influenced by the French aspect of Chaucer's genius. Chaucer has written in all the three poems. He wrote all the three languages, sorry, in French, Latin, as well as English. So Stephen House, he was influenced by the Chaucer's French writings. Okay, so the main works of Stephen House are the Pastime of Pleasure, the Example of Virtue, the Conversion of Swearers, and a Joyful Meditechino. He is the most inspired poet among English Chaucerians, and he uses allegory, which is drawn from Geoffrey Chaucer, and his allegorical methods are very crude. They are not very polished, and his style is, spoiled by excessive use of Latinized words and awkward construction. So altogether, you can say that these people tried to get into the shoes of Geoffrey Chaucer, but because of lack of originality, because of lack of depth, because of lack of that creative imagination, because of lack of that artistic qualities or creation, they failed to achieve the standard which Geoffrey Chaucer had set. And this is why their poetry suffers from the defects of other, just like other 15th century poets. They have a confused meter, a kind of very loose construction, and their language is also, it becomes a kind of bizarre kind of diction. Bizarre means very strange, because they try to experiment too much, and they try to get into the shoes or try to copy or imitate the style of Chaucer, but they lack is creative imagination. They lack is a solid versification. They lack is novelty. They lack is originality. They lack the this solid construction which Geoffrey Chaucer had. Uh, okay, so because of these lackness of these qualities, their poetry becomes a kind of confusing kind of creation, which does not have a solid meter, which does not have a flawless construction, and whose language is also become quite confusing. Okay, so next is Alexander Barclay. Barclay is written Ship of Fools, in which he reviews every kind of folly which men commit in life. Okay, so it deals with the vices and failings of every kind which have a very loose connection, and he satirizes men and women from the medical profession, the clergy, and the fashion of the day. So this is what they have drawn from Geoffrey Chaucer. In Canterbury Tale, Geoffrey Chaucer, satirizes this the church and other people who are part of it, this particular uh, uh, creation. These fellows, these people who followed him, they also try the same thing, right? Alexander Barclay, he tries to satirize men and women from the medical profession, the clergy, and the fashions of the day. But again, they fall very short of those high standards which Geoffrey Chaucer had set. And in this book, he shows deep hatred for the vice of usury, and uh, he has also written eclogues, uh, which are kind of pastorals. Pastoral poems are the ones which are, connected with common human beings who live close to nature, like the shepherds, and they contain beautiful pictures of country life. Country life means rural life, life in uh, uh, the lap of nature. That's what is written, the eclogues. Okay. Then the last one is John Skelton. It's called John Skelton. He was the most original and spirited English Chaucerian. You can call him the most original and spirited English Chaucerian. He was a great humanist, just like Geoffrey Chaucer. He employs fresh metrical form of expression which suits his subject matter. Okay, so he has some qualities which were uh, there in Geoffrey Chaucer. First thing is he also follows that same humanist spirit which Geoffrey Chaucer did. Second thing is he employs some fresh metrical forms, just like Geoffrey Chaucer. Okay, and but his rhythms are rude, and they lack that freshness, the vigor. Okay, so his main works are the Book of Colin Clout, Why Come Ye Not to Court, Book of Philip Sparrow, the Tuning Dirge on Edward uh, IV, and the Bows of Court. Okay, so these are the works. You cannot remember them all, but you can remember one or two which are important, like the Book of Colin Clout. He satirizes Wolsey. Okay, uh, then in later work, uh, his later work has freshness and individual flavor. He is also a moralist who attacked the abuses of clergy and the court. So you can understand now, almost all of them, they are writing about the abuses of the clergy and the court. Not court, but clergy, about that corrupt church and all. And as a metrist, he neglected heroic verse, which was used by Geoffrey Chaucer, and used a short, irregular line. That is what he did. That was something innovative he did. And though he started as an imitative poet, He soon broke away from the old conventions of verse, suggesting new forms. So this is what something original which he contributed to English poetry. Not like the other poets who continued following Geoffrey Chaucer's style, but they failed to continue the spirit or the level, the creative genius of Geoffrey Chaucer, because they lacked originality, they lacked depth, they lacked novelty, and that is why all of them they fail as imitators of Geoffrey Chaucer. But John Skelton, he appears a little class apart because he understood that his poetry or his writings, they did not fit the traditional style of Geoffrey Chaucer, like using a heroic couplet or using rhyme royal. So he introduced a kind of irregular line, a short irregular line. So he suggested some new forms, and that is how he infused life in English poetry at a time when it was most needed. So this is that is why he is regarded a little higher than all his contemporaries. So this is all about